Shami, could we have back on screen the document we were looking at before the break? So SBTS 40395_091. Professor Lowe, it must have come, one would have thought, as something of a shock or cause for concern in late 1985 for Dr. Forbes, his co-director, for you as the new consultant, to learn that patients were still apparently seroconverting, with a question mark being raised about the involvement of heat-treated concentrates. Can you recall what, if any, inquiry or investigation was undertaken into this and what its outcome was?
Well, first of all, I don't think it has been proven. If we start with patient 3, the fiber, I've no idea if that fiber was heat treated or no, probably wasn't. It was 1984 to 1985. I can't remember at what stage fiber was heat treated, and it wouldn't have been the porcine. So I don't think that...
Can I just stop you there, Professor? I think the question is not whether the report is accurate, but the way that Council put the question was, given that there was a question mark about it, what investigations were undertaken to see whether it was. So that's what I think you're being asked about. I'm not sure you're answering the question.
Right. This letter, well, I'm trying to think what I would have thought when I got this letter from Dr. Maddock, or been told by Dr. Forbes on the 4th of September. I would have been, yes. The initial reaction would be, this might mean that the heat treatment is not working. But then when I read it, and then going through it today, I don't think there's any evidence that this was a failure of heat treatment, because I think all the all the batches that patient 1 and patient 2 had were non-heat treated. This is not a seroconversion. This is probably a late seroconversion from non-heat treated concentrates. Now, I can't recall what further studies were done after this, but this would not have been too shocking if you read it.
Do you know whether any inquiry or investigation was undertaken beyond the sending of the letter by Dr. Maddock to Dr. Cash?
Oh, I think these Dr. Maddock's surveillance carried on for a long time, because clearly the first thing you do as a manufacturer, SNBTS, is to say, for the next several years, could you continue to test patients who are HIV negative for HIV, because that's the only way we're going to find out. Now, my recollection is that within 2 years, from memory, there was no evidence of seroconversion on heat treatment. I'm pretty sure you'll find this in the Penrose inquiry. If you look at the Penrose inquiry reports about seroconversions, because there's a lot of work done between SMBTS and the Haemophilia centres on the other. I don't recall that ever coming out in the Penrose report.
Professor Lowe, I'm not asking what the ultimate outcome might have been as a result of work undertaken for the Penrose inquiry decades later. I'm asking what the process was, or the response was, at the time to this information, and what, if any, steps were taken to further investigate the matter or consider a suspension of treatment or anything of that kind. Was anything done at the centre, or was it just filed and life went on?
No, it wouldn't have been filed. This was a continuing process. I think that's what I'm trying to say to you. This, Dr. Cash asked for regular reports. I'm sure you must have it in the correspondence from all the centre directors saying, please keep testing and please keep me updated regularly. And this is one in a series of reports that Dr. Maddock and Dr. Forbes's and Dr. Davidson's continued investigation would be. I can't see evidence in this letter that any of these patients got heat treated product before their positive tests. But this would be a continuing process. And if you want to know if further investigations were done, I'm pretty sure it's all in the Penrose report. I cannot remember any seroconversions following this date.
Did your patients know, were they told that they were being tested for HTLV3 on a continuing and ongoing basis?
Yes, so over the course of 1985, I think that all the patients who had treatment had got the letters, got the appointments, had then been pre-counseled about HIV testing, and all through that year, patients were coming up and being tested. I don't recall any of the patients saying, "I don't want a test," ever. I think that some wanted time to think about it, which is entirely reasonable, and that was part of the counselling that Dr. Wilkie said, "Well, that's fine. If you want to think about it and discuss with people, that's fine. Let us know when you're ready to have a test, and we'll have a test." And of course, the other thing that was happening then was that people were getting from life assurance companies, "Oh, I see you've got haemophilia. We want to know if you're HIV positive or negative, so we know if we need to load your premium or not." So I'm pretty sure everybody came up, if not by the end of 85, into 86, and we tested them and said, "We want to do this regularly," and explained why. He said, "It's not only for your benefit, it's for the good public health reason that if we ever find a patient who's seroconverted, having been previously negative, on an SMBTS product, we want to know about it. We want to trace other recipients of that match." So everybody knew that it was in the public interest as well as their own interest. Yes, they knew, and yes, they approved.
Were you involved in telling any patients at this time about their HTLV3 diagnosis?
I think only one patient. In 1985, yes, I had to tell one patient who'd been cancelled and tested, and they were now positive. And it was a very hard thing for both of us, obviously.
Is that the patient whose circumstances are described using a pseudonym in the Penrose report?
Yes, the anonymised patient is discussed, and I discussed it in the Penrose report.
Whose evidence, as recorded in the Penrose report, is that he did not know he was being tested by you for HTLV3?
Well, I was giving him the result of a positive test following another doctor seeing the patient and taking the sample and counselling the patient. There is a conflict between what the doctor who took the sample told Dr. Forbes and what the patient said as to the amount of counselling.
Was it at this time the practice of the clinicians in the centre to record in medical records discussions about counselling and consent to testing?
That should have been in the records, yes.
Should have been, but you don't know whether as a matter of routine it was recorded.
I think that this test was done fairly quickly, and by the time Dr. Forbes got the report, and he asked me to see the patient because he couldn't fit in the appointment that week, so this was the first time I'd had to break the news as a new consultant to a patient. I think that by that time the doctor taking the sample was away, and the letter to the general practitioner had not been sent, so it was difficult to know what degree of records there were.
Forgive me, I don't think that quite answers my question. My question is, at this time, was there a practice of recording in the patient records discussions that the clinician would have with the patient about the wish to undertake a HTLV3 test, so the pre-test counselling process, and the patient's response to that? You must have seen multiple records, Professor, as the person who took over as director a few years later. Was that routinely recorded?
I think it depends what stage, because the initial interviews, as I am told by Dr. Forbes and Dr. Wilkie, they were held in private because it was a very complicated series of discussion to explain about the situation. And I think the records of Dr. Forbes and Dr. Wilkie's discussions with the patient, and I think probably what the patients agreed with, is they did not want these put in the records at that time because of the fear of loss of confidentiality.
Did Dr. Forbes and Dr. Wilkie then make records that were retained elsewhere of their discussions with patients, and if so, where?
Well, if you read Dr. Wilkie's evidence, I understand it that they saw these patients out with at the Haemophilia Centre in a private room and had confidential discussions which were recorded. But I think Dr. Wilkie also says that some patients were very concerned that these should not be in their case records, at least initially. By the time that I was seeing patients, if patients with positive results, most of whom had been previously seen by Dr. Forbes, I would say, are you happy that I fully record our conversation about the tests in the notes, and I file your HIV positive result in the notes? And this, I think, was a recurring theme across the UK, that some patients were very unhappy about that. But my policy was always to say, I think it's in everybody's interest if we could show in the records that we have documented the discussions that we've had and that the result is there. And the other question I would always ask is, it would normally be our practice to include this information in the letter to the general practitioner, but that would be marked private and confidential, only to be opened by Dr. such and such. And I think that was the correct thing to do. I think so. I think in the Penrose inquiry, patient experiences was quite a lot of documentation about patient concern, and certainly I think in Dr. Wilkie's evidence.
Okay. Leaving aside Dr. Wilkie's evidence, which we can read for ourselves, did you ever see, when you were taking over the care of these patients, the records as part of the materials available to you which showed a proper pre-test counselling process being undertaken in 1985?
I think it was variable. I think that might have depended on the patient's views as to whether that should be included in the records or not. But all the patients that I was seeing from December 1985 onwards, I would be very clear and say it would be very good for all parties if everything is properly recorded and the results and the letter to the GP marked private and confidential. I think it is very important to have all this documented.
Do you have any knowledge of how Dr. Follett came to undertake testing of patients who'd been treated at, and in a number of cases were still patients at, York Hill?
I have no knowledge of York Hill patients, no.
So I'm going to move on to look at numbers of patients infected. Was there anything in relation to
yes,
testing?
there is just something I want to to ask you about, Professor.
So I'm sorry, Sir Brown, could you take the document off the screen so I can...
Yes.
so I can see everybody?
Has it gone?
Yes, it has.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just be clear that from the last 40 minutes or so of your testimony, what the chronology was? Let me just run through and see if my understanding is correct. That sometime after July 1984, 77 stored samples of sera from Glasgow Royal Infirmary were sent off to Gallows Laboratory in the States for testing.
Yes.
That in October, you had the results back. Sometime in October.
Well, I was told about the results. I attended the meeting with Dr. Melby, Dr. Forbes, Dr. Maddock, and we went through discussion of the results and the drafting of the paper.
So the results, just on the chronology, the results came back in October and were discussed at that meeting.
Yes, there was a meeting in October, and the results must have clearly come back in, September, I would guess. I don't know the details of that.
So sometime before, at any rate, October, probably September, October. And those results showed that there were 12 seropositive people testing seropositive on that test who had their sera stored at Glasgow, were Glasgow patients.
So I understand.
There was an article written about that, which was printed in the Lancet on December the 22nd, so 29th, must be 29th of 1984, the last Lancet of the year, which must have been prepared sometime before that for publication.
Yes.
So what would that be, a month or two? Probably, roughly.
I would guess a month or two. I think we were asked about this during the Penrose inquiry, and I think it was pointed out that the Lancet was quite good in publishing relatively rapidly compared to other journals. They wanted to be first in the field, as it were. I would have thought that the draft would have been sent in maybe November.
Thank you. On the 8th of January, a letter dated, at any rate, the 8th of January, was prepared for possible sending by Dr. Forbes and was plainly discussed with you or mentioned to you because your name appears on it, although there was a discussion about why that should be. So at that stage, your understanding was that none of the patients involved had yet been told that they might be seropositive.
That was my understanding.
That you later discovered, from what Dr. Forbes told you in the margins of the Penrose inquiry, that he had decided to revise the letter after discussion of it at the UKHCDO Working Party on the 11th of April.
I'm very clear that he said, I'm not going to send the letter out this week on the 8th or 9th or whatever, because there's a meeting of the AIDS group on the 11th, and we want to generally consider what kind of information should be sent to patients, and I want to reflect upon that. And then, as I think I said, I don't know if that letter was sent in that format, and my discussions many years later, in 2015, 2016, when I saw Dr. Forbes, and I raised this point, he said, oh yes, there was a lot of thinking about what names, but I really can't remember. But he said, looking at the letter, it strikes me as surprising that you would be the first name. So I don't know.
The note I have is that there was a meeting on the 11th of April of the Working Party. I thought that was the meeting you were talking about. Perhaps it was the 11th of some month earlier, was it, or not? Can you help?
No, I only recently found the minutes of the AIDS group, which Dr. Forbes chaired, and item 2 in the first page, it says the chairman presented an information package which he had produced containing publications and reports which he thought were useful and informative. Now,
So that's the 11th of April, 1985.
I'm sorry, this is the 11th of January, 1985.
In January, thank you.
Meeting of AIDS Group of Haemophilia Centre Directors.
So,
And sorry, what I was trying to say, Sir Brian, was Dr. Forbes said, I don't want to send this out until letters like this are discussed at this meeting.
yeah. And at some time after that, but you don't know when, a letter bearing your name telling the Glasgow patients that of some of the risks of AIDS and saying, amongst other things, that about 10% had positive antibody tests was sent out.
Yes, I guess so.
Well, that's
unless
what
that figure was changed, but it seems...
That's what the letter of the 8th of January 1985 appears to say.
Yeah.
Perhaps we should just have a look at that, shall we, Shumek? It's PRSE 40859. And small point this, I just want your help on it. We've recently tested stored blood samples from many of our patients, of whom about 10% have positive antibody tests. Bear in mind the 10%. Can we go back, please, to the Lancet letter, the Lancet publication? You have the reference for that, please.
Yes, it's PRSE 301630, Shomek.
Thank you. Now, just looking at the summary, can we highlight the summary, please? There, it tells us in the text that the Scottish samples all came from the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. Do you know how 15.6% became 10%, went from 1 in 6 to 1 in 10?
No, I don't.
Thank you. Given the chronology, it would follow, would it? It must follow that it was at least over 3 months, probably over 4, between Dr. Forbes knowing that there were positive seropositive tests for antibody in 15.6% of his patients, before the first of them could even have been told, before the letter was even sent out. That would be what inevitable conclusion from the chronology, would it not?
Yes, it would.
And if the letter was not sent and the letter was replaced by one later on, as we've seen sometime in April 1985, very similar to the first, so it may well be that the conclusion is that it was the same letter modified. Not until after that.
Oh, no, no. The April letter very much went out in April. I don't know what date in April, but it did go out. What I'm not sure about is, and I'm pretty sure that this draft letter, if you like, of the 8th of January went out in January, because Dr. Forbes was very keen, having discussed it with his colleagues, that it should go out with early appointments to pick up, I would imagine, the patients who tested positive and start counselling them and getting samples, because it was his obligation to try and find out with a reliable test if these were false positives or not. So he was very keen to get the process started, and the process started with information, and then saying, I enclose an appointment, and I think that was good. I think Dr. Forbes may have been unique in actually sending the patients most at risk, in other words, those who were provisionally positive but needing the definitive test, sending them an actual appointment, and in fact giving them a number to ring if they wanted to find out about it. Now, certainly nobody rang me, but I think he was very clear that having engaged Dr. Wilkie, who was very keen to help him in January, they would start the counselling process. And because that would take some time, the patients needed information and they needed to think about it, and then they would give informed consent to a fresh sample being taken for Dr. Follett to do the testing once he had a reliable test set up. And that seems to me an entirely ethical process that Dr. Forbes took. And I think his letter was very open. I don't know what other letters were sent from other haemophilia centres in Britain, but I think Lord Penrose in his final report said, I think this was a good letter and it was sent rapidly, offered them appointment, and that was generally fine.
Well, two questions arise out of the chronology when it was known in September/October that 15.6% of the Scottish cohort were seropositive on one test, and the fact that they weren't, any of them, told about that until after mid-January at the earliest, 1985. The first is in relation to something you said in evidence when you were asked about Dr. Forbes, and you said you thought that he might have been very conflicted as between his duty in publishing his research and his duty to the patients concerned. You recall saying that?
Yes. Could also say, Sir Brian, my written statement 4110.
Well, I'm going to come to that in a moment, but if you can just deal with this question first, because you don't mention that there. As between his duty to his patients and his interest in publishing research, where do you suppose the ethical position lies? Might it not perhaps lie with the duty to the patient as trumping all?
No, Sir Brian, I don't, with respect. I think the first duty of all the haemophilia centre directors in Britain who sent samples stored or unstored, usually without permission from the patient, was doing a time-tested emergency procedure in public health. You have the first test for a spreading pandemic of a virus, and the public health approach is to say, there's a test for this baffling new, potentially fatal disease, which at least gives us some measure of the exposure to this virus in the blood donor population, which has gone to the high-risk group of patients who'd had multiple exposure. I think that was the ethos of doing the study. If you read the minutes of the UK HCDO meetings which were going on in the summer, I think Dr. Krask is saying, well, Dr. Tedder has a test and we need to do this. I think the prime purpose there, it was like hepatitis B on its discovery in the 1970s. We need to know, what is the risk. We need to test it, and it's important to publish the prevalence anonymously, just to show what the extent of the situation is and take appropriate measures. And the most important thing that arose from the testing in Scotland, from Edinburgh and Glasgow, was as soon as the data is clear that it is the SNBTS products and not just the commercial products that have been used in Glasgow a few years before. These are the current products, and this transmission must be stopped, and hence the very urgent meeting of Scottish Haemophilia Centre directors, SNBTS, and Scottish Government, Scottish Health Department saying, right, what's the action that we need to take? How soon can you get heat-treated, virally inactivated concentrate to replace, as soon as possible, the stuff that patients on treatment have in their homes? This is an emergency. This is a public health emergency. You have to stop further infections. And I think that this was addressed extremely rapidly in SNBTS. Fortunately, they had this heat-treated product oven ready, perhaps, almost ready to go, and it could be done. And that was just a very appropriate thing to do. The data was published anonymously. I think Lord Penrose made that point. I'm sorry to keep going back to Penrose inquiry, but all the details of the dates and things are in there, and appropriate action was taken. I think that was the number one.
I should make it clear that this inquiry is its own inquiry. Yes. We are looking at the facts. We are looking at a much wider range in terms of reference than Lord Penrose had. We have different evidence, much wider evidence, because it's UK-wide. Whereas I'm very happy to note the facts upon which Lord Penrose based his conclusions. He may not have had all the facts that we have in a number of areas, and I must draw my own conclusions as to what happened or didn't happen and why. Now that's for me. On the facts, then a lot of the facts I'm very happy to take from what he has found as facts, but one has to distinguish between facts and opinions. And also,
Sir Brian, I apologise if I'm mixing up the two. What I am
it's because you keep going back to the Penrose inquiry, etc. What you said to the Penrose inquiry is what you've said. That's fine. What he said about matters, it may be right. I'm not saying it isn't, but it may not be. I'm not saying it's that either. But I have to make my own mind up as a matter of conclusion, because this is a different inquiry on its own evidence, its own terms of reference, looking at it at a wider time scale, looking at hepatitis B as well, and so on. So if we can just park his conclusions for the moment, I'd be grateful.
I will immediately withdraw any conclusions of Lord Penrose and only cite the Penrose inquiry as a source of suitable material for you, Sir Brian, to examine independently and perhaps with much wider evidence. I accept that absolutely.
Thank you very much.
So my just to resume and try and make it as quick as possible. I think the first obligation of testing a sample of stored serum samples in patients with haemophilia or any other group that's an at-risk population to establish the extent of a new infection and take appropriate action to turn off the tap to stop any further patients being infected is a priority. But the second obligation clearly is, what do you do now? And this is the dilemma that not only Dr. Forbes, but other Haemophilia Centre directors are confronted with, because particularly, and this is very evident to me, Sir Brian, if you look at the second meeting of Dr. Forbes's age group, where having discussed with Haemophilia Centre directors, I think it's a February meeting. I don't know if you want to put that up on the screen, but
well, you're really being asked about the obligation of a doctor.
Yeah.
And in summary, what you're telling me is that you think that the doctor's obligation here is primarily, and first, to public health, where there is a pandemic or an epidemic or some serious transmissible disease involved, rather than to the patient. And I was going to ask you, when you finished what you have to say, by all means go on, but I was going to ask you, do you know of anything, and it's a real question as whether you know of anything that might have prevented Professor Forbes telling patients, even between the date that the manuscript was prepared for publication and the date it was published. After all,
yes, I can.
After all, they might have been regarded, might they not, as potential transmitters of a disease, if indeed they did turn out to be infected, and thereby, by telling them, you might perhaps serve the interests of public health as well. But that's maybe a matter for argument at a later stage. It's not a matter of fact.
Could I address that now,
Certainly.
Sir Brian? So, number one, public health, because you can do that very quickly. And you don't need anybody's consent to do that. Turn off the tap, stop the flow. The second obligation of a doctor, who's also a researcher, is to say, now, what do I do about telling the patient? And what I was going to say is that at this February meeting, consulted at leisure, Dr. Tedder is there, and he's talking about the tests. And he said, well, thanks for sending me all these samples, but could I just say that my test is not very good? It's not been clinically validated. It's suitable for research. And I have reservations about its accuracy, and I am not alone. I think, briefly, he's saying the test that I have, and indeed the test that Dr. Gallo has, that the Glasgow results sent for, is a research test. And he is giving the virologist's view is this is a test for research. It gives you an idea. It gives you a direction. It is probably fine for public health control because you've got quite a large number of patients. You have reasonably reliable data to take a course of action, advise the government, Department of Health, whatever. But your next obligation is you have a test that is not been clinically validated. There are false positives, there are false negatives. And you have to think, if you tell the patient about a research test that is not clinically approved by the National Health Service, what would be the consequence of giving a patient a false negative test and the patient says, that's absolutely fine, I'll go on having sex or not modifying anything that could result in transmission to another person. And then months or years later, it turns out to be positive. That's a catastrophe. On the other hand, if you have a false positive test and the patient's life is ruined and they jump off a bridge or whatever, and then it turns out when a reliable test comes along, it's actually truly negative. And that is the difficulty. And this is the position that Dr. Follett made very clear to Dr. Forbes. And the reference for this, Sir Brian, is the Scottish Medical Journal 1987 issue, which Dr. Forbes, as editor of the Scottish Medical Journal, produced. And it has an article in virology testing for HIV by Dr. Follett. And it makes very clear that the ELISA tests, the first ones out, are not reliable and must always be confirmed by a reliable assay, which he eventually had. And that was the approach that Dr. Follett took. Yes, there's a screening test that's cheap and cheerful, but if you get a positive, you have to have it confirmed by a reliable, more expensive test. And Dr. Follett, even in 1987, was sending results of 2 different tests by 2 different methods in his laboratory to Dr. Tedder if he wasn't sure. Now, that is the right way to do it, because then you're giving patients a correct diagnosis and correct advice. And that is why I think Dr. Forbes was very professional in this, and he sent early appointments to the patients that were positive on the Gallo test, which was unreliable, explain the position and say, I want to tell you about this test, but it's important that we want to repeat all the tests in all our patients with a reliable test so that we know what the true situation is. And that's important for you and your family, and that's important for us. And that is the ethical action that he took. And I think it would be the same in all the other haemophilia centres that use the Tedder test. I would have hoped that they would have thought in the same way.
Well, I have your answer. Thank you for the comment which you made during the time as to where the doctor's primary duty lay. Can I ask you this, also in the light of the chronology, which I've set out, and you've agreed, it's paragraph 4.10 of your witness statement. Shimmick, If we can go to the witness statement, it's 34960, and it's paragraph 41.10, which is page 92. You say there that you think that Dr. Forbes' letter was very prompt. How do you support that in the light of the chronology?
It was prompt because by this time he had arranged a system in which he could tell the patients in an appropriate manner. And that system was first to get an experienced counsellor to join him in speaking to the patient and their families, if they wished, about what the situation was. Because by this time he was working with Dr. Follett to say, as soon as possible, can you get me a reliable test? So by sending out appointments in January, he's got that done. He couldn't have done that before, I don't think, because he hadn't got Dr. Wilkie to agree to do the counselling with him. And Dr. Follett said, right, I'm doing it, but it's going to take a while, but get on with starting the process of counselling and getting a sample. Then as soon as I can get a reliable test arranged, I will do that. I think that was prompt action.
Very prompt?
How prompt is prompt? I don't know.
The words are yours.
Right. I'm trying to think. Dr. Forbes has the results by what, October? On these
you said September, October.
Yeah. So let's work out the chronology. So what's he going to do? He's going to think about how reliable are the tests, and he will speak, I assume, to Dr. Follett, and then at a later stage, Dr. Tedder, when the age group starts meeting in February to confirm. So how soon can I get a reliable test? But I think pretty immediately, according to his evidence and Dr. Wilkie's test, he's thought, well, I know the ideal person, working in the Department of Medicine on kidney disease. And he was getting Dr. Wilkie funding and the agreement of Professor Kennedy to employ her. Her own evidence, I think, says, I turned from seeing kidney patients 4 days a week to seeing haemophilia patients 2 days a week. It was very promptly arranged. And she was, I think, the most appropriate person to do it. She was an experienced counsellor, and she got ready to do it as well. So those stages of the process, I think, were appropriate. But meantime, having done that, I think it was appropriate to publish the information in the Lancet. I think that's an important contribution to the epidemiology. It shows, using anonymous data of Danish and Scottish patients, that on aggregate, there's no doubt that in European haemophilia centres, it is the commercial concentrate that carries the highest risk. I think that is not too bad a sequence of events. And then he gets on with writing letters to the patient within 2 weeks of the Lancet paper coming out, explaining the situation and saying, right, we're now starting this process of giving you information and giving you the autonomy to hear about the whole situation and to think about and then hopefully give consent to a proper test that will clarify the situation for you and your family. I think that is not unreasonable.
Was there any record that you know of kept of when the 12 patients were actually informed?
No, as I was, well, I don't know.
Well, that's all that I don't think I can take your evidence any further than that. But thank you for that explanation, Professor. It's been quite illuminating.
So some further questions I have arising out of that. Professor Lowe, at the meeting in October 1984, which you attended, Dr. Forbes was at, Dr. Frobel was at which the results and the publication were discussed, was there any discussion about the risks faced by the sexual partners or family members of the haemophiliac patients who had, on the testing so far, turned out to be HTLV3 positive?
Well, it was, I think, a two-stage meeting. The first meeting was with Dr. Melby, and that was basically going through the data, putting together a paper. I can't remember if there was any discussion with Dr. Melby, who was an epidemiologist, looking, I think, particularly at the gay population in Denmark, and obviously would be addressing the issues that you're addressing now about sexual transmission as well as blood transmission. I can't remember if there was discussion with Dr. Melby. I don't know. But what I do remember is Dr. Maddock then taking Dr. Melby to the airport, and Dr. Frobel and I having a long discussion with Dr. Forbes about, well, what do you do now? And Dr. Frobel pointed out the problems about false positives, false negatives, needs for confirmation, etc. And then, of course, it would be, well, what are we going to do about information to patients about sexual partners? And I think what Dr. Forbes, my recollection is that what Dr. Forbes was thinking about is, right, again, public health. The first priority is this kind of core letter that goes out from all haemophilia centres to their patients saying, right, here's a problem because we have HIV infection in the blood donor pool, and we're now trying to sort out what is the situation for you by getting testing arranged. In the meantime, the most important thing to do, having got the non-heat treated construct back, is for you to think about sexual transmission, which we know is a risk with this new virus, and to advise everybody who's had blood products to wear condoms, etc., to protect sexual transmission. And that is the clear message that I think is going out from all the haemophilia centres in Britain. And I think Dr. Peter Jones's book, which we sent out in April, we would have sent it earlier, but it sold out like hotcakes. It had to be reprinted. And by April, we had a copy to send in the second letter. And that is very clear about that. And it's a clear message from the Haemophilia Society bulletins and the Hemofact sheets. And it's a clear message at this stage to anybody in Britain and the general public.
Professor Lowe, what's the answer to my question, please? Was there any explicit discussion at the meeting in October 1984 about the possible risks faced by the sexual partners and family members of the 12 patients who at that stage were understood to be HTLV3 positive? Was it actually considered at all at the meeting?
That was Dr. Forbes's responsibility as a consultant in charge of the patient to make. He was clearly thinking long and hard about it at the time. I don't recall. I mean, Dr. Frobel was a scientist. I'm a clinician, but Dr. Forbes knows a lot more about AIDS than I do because he's been working on it solidly for 2 years. He was clearly thinking very hard about it. I don't think he told Dr. Frobel and I exactly what he was going to do.
Was there any discussion at all about the issue at the meeting that you can recall? Yes or no?
I honestly can't remember. I think it was part of a general conversation, but I don't think it was a major part of the meeting which was focused on the paper, and then Dr. Frobel and I starting to raise with Dr. Forbes, right, what are you going to do about getting reliable tests and contacting the patients?
Now, as I understand your evidence from earlier this afternoon, the more reliable tests were not available for Dr. Follett to use until around April of 1985. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So at the point at which, if Dr. Forbes did send out a letter in January 1985, at that point, there were still no reliable tests, but he was, if the letter was sent, providing information and getting the ball rolling. Why could that letter, that January 85 letter, not have been sent at the end of October 1984, which would at least have put patients on notice that some had tested positive and that further testing was required to confirm the position, and that in the meantime they should take all sensible precautions?
That's a good question, and I don't know. I think that Dr. Forbes, like other haemophilia centre directors, would be giving information about the risk of AIDS, and I cannot recall, because I was not involved at all in 1984, about what information was being advised by the Haemophilia Society or UK HCDO about, now that there are cases of AIDS in Britain and blood is a possibility, would that be a wise precaution to take in all patients? I honestly don't know the extent of that information.
Can you think of any practical or other reason why Dr. Forbes could not have sent the 8th of January letter at the end of October 1984?
I can't at this moment really think about that, no.
Do you know, from your own knowledge, and as someone who took over the directorship of the Haemophilia Centre in '88, whether any of the 12 Gallo tests were found to be false positives on confirmatory testing?
I think what Dr. Follett told us, and what I think is perhaps at that 31st of May meeting, I think they were all, no, I'm sorry, hang on a minute. I think from memory there was one query positive, and they didn't know. And I think Dr. Follett's test said it was definitely negative.
Because your 16% that you voiced at that meeting of the 31st of May 1985 to Dr. Follett and others is very similar to the 15.6% recorded in the Lancet article. It doesn't appear that confirmatory testing had revealed a significantly different picture, does it?
Sorry, just run those figures past me again. What's
the Lancet
difference?
Article recorded 15.6% of the patients tested being HTLV positive. You, in the meeting of the 31st of May 1985 with Dr. Follett, used the figure 16%. The confirmatory testing did not reveal a significantly different picture from the Gallo testing, did it?
No, I think that is just rounded up. I think 16 and 15.6% are the same figure.
The Lancet article, if we go back to it, PRSE 0001630, please show Mick. And if we go to the second page, please. Right-hand column, bottom half of the page. In Scotland, 11% of 62 haemophilia A and 1 of 15 haemophilia B patients were HTLV3 positive. Doesn't say there it's a preliminary test, there's a lot of doubt, we don't really know, we don't know the significance of it. It's stated in terms to the world that these patients are HTLV3 positive, isn't it?
Yes.
If we go then to the letter, please, of the 8th of January, And leaving aside the uncertainty as to whether it was sent or not, PRSE 40859. And if we look at the long paragraph in the bottom half of the page, it says, just over halfway down, we have recently tested stored blood samples from many of our patients, of whom about 10% have positive antibody tests. And then it goes on to say, compare the Scottish and the English position. Now again, there's nothing there, is there, to say, but we doubt that they're correct or they're uncertain. It's being stated in terms, 10% have positive antibody tests.
Yeah, it says about 10%. Yeah.
Whereas it actually should mean 16%, shouldn't it?
Well, if it's just Glasgow, yes, as opposed to Scotland as a whole.
Well, it was only, yeah, I see.
Yes, you'll recall, Sir, Dr. Ludlam was asked about the 10%, and it's not quite clear precisely how the figures were calculated at that point in time, I think. But there's nothing said here, is there, about there being uncertainty about the testing?
That is correct.
And if we go on to the top of the next page, and forgive me, this is a question I meant to ask you when we were looking at this previously and omitted to do. Top of the page says we would also like to perform some skin tests which measure the body's defences against infections. What were those skin tests and what was their purpose?
So at the time, skin tests were in vogue, if you like, in terms of HIV positive patients as being a measure of susceptibility to develop clinical complications of AIDS, because, as it says, they measure the body's defences against infection. And I think the more depressed the immunity, that was a clinically relevant guide as to the patients whose HIV positive has about risks of infection. So it wasn't a research test. It would be well, was it? No, because there was a broader question that I think you explored with Professor Ludlam last week in some detail. Was it only HIV that was the one thing to consider in AIDS, or was it the body's defences against infections in general, that perhaps through just general exposure to blood products and foreign proteins was an important issue? So both as a prognostic issue for the patient, and I think that was the initial reason. I don't think the skin test lasted very long, because with the passage of time, it wasn't so much an indication of risk of getting HIV, but as you may come to later, Dr. Maddock continued, as did Professor Ludlam in Edinburgh, to perform skin tests because it was apparent that some HIV negative patients with haemophilia had these measures of reduced defense, even though they were HIV negative, and that required investigation.
Okay, well, we may need to come back to the skin tests when we consider the question of research, probably tomorrow. Can we then pick up the question of numbers infected at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary by reference to the table in the Penrose Inquiry report? PRSE 307002, please, Shomik. It's page 97 of the numbered pages. I can't remember how many we need to add on. Do you want to try 103 and see where we get to? So 5 more pages, 5 pages further on. That's it. So if we just look here at what's recorded in the report about numbers, 3.281 tells us that Dr. Campbell Tate, director, gave evidence about the results of the exercise in Glasgow. In the final count, 12 patients contracted HIV infection while attending the GRI Haemophilia Centre. And then we have the data in the table, which I'll come back to in a moment. Paragraph 3.282, 10 of the 12 patients had haemophilia A, 8 severe and 2 moderate, and 2 had haemophilia B, patients G10 and G11. Most of the patients received both commercial products and SMBTS products. It's not always possible to be confident of a robust allocation of imported or PFC products as being the cause of HIV infection. The cause of infection in 3 cases, G3, 6 and 12, appears clearly to have been the use of imported factor 8. 3 patients received only PFC factor 8 between their last negative and first positive HIV test. It appears that these 3 patients were very probably infected by an SMBTS product. Retrospective testing of stored data where available showed that of the 12 patients infected with HIV, and then we have the various dates of seroconversion. So 1 in 81, 82, 2, 82, 83, 1 between 82 and 84, 1 between 82 and 86, 1 in 84, 85, 1 in 85, 86, 1 during 1985, and for 4 patients whose date of last, go to the next page, negative HIV test is not known. The first HIV positive tests were respectively April 81, November 82, May 84, and November 85. If we can go back then to the table on the previous page, please, Shomek. I was going to ask if you can assist at all with this, with understanding this table. First of all, this work obviously was undertaken by Dr. Campbell Tate for the inquiry after your retirement. But what, if any, work was undertaken whilst you were still director in the 80s or in the 90s to try and establish the dates of seroconversion?
Well, we continued to do, for these individuals.
Yes, well, for the individuals that you had under your care, yes.
Right, so Dr. Maddock, under Dr. Forbes, continued to analyze this in relationship to treatments and report to SNBTS after Dr. Forbes left for Dundee, and I succeeded him in co-director end of 87. So we continued to do this work. I cannot remember any seroconversions after Dr. Forbes left. We did have. There's always the possibility that patients who have been treated at the Royal Infirmary and gone somewhere else, or just don't come at all, come back to us later, and then you do the tests. But I can't remember acquiring any patients who had been treated at Royal Infirmary who came back and were found to be a new case of positivity.
Do you know, again, from your own knowledge in your capacity as consultant and director at the Centre for many years, whether of the patients who were infected through their treatment at the Royal Infirmary, any of them were the broader West of Scotland patients, or whether they were all, as it were, full-time Royal Infirmary patients?
I think these were all patients who attended Glasgow Royal Infirmary. Obviously, over the years, we acquired HIV positive patients from York Hill, who were clearly infected at York Hill. We acquired patients from other adult hospitals in Scotland. I can't name them, but I think there were 3 who had received treatment at that hospital and were then found to be HIV positive, and they agreed to transfer to Royal Infirmary because of the services we'd set up about care of HIV-infected patients with haemophilia. Dr. Wilkie, infectious diseases, etc.
I just have a handful of questions about what we can see from the table about some of the individual cases. I'm not asking you in answering them to give any information that might identify any individual. G1 is last negative January 82, first positive September 86. Now, that seems, looking at the table, a fairly late stage at which to be performing an HTLV3 test and identifying it as positive. Do you know why it was that it was only in September of 86 that a positive test was found?
No, I don't. I mean, patients move around. Patients can go off and live somewhere else and then come back. I find it difficult at this stage to work out who these people are.
In relation to the two patients who we are told in this paragraph are haemophilia B patients, so that's patient G10 and G11. In relation to G11, we can see last negative is said to be October 85, first positive July 86. The treatment is said to be defix. Now, are you able to assist us with how a patient during that period was seroconverting on factor 9 when by then heat-treated factor 9 should have been available?
No, I don't recognize this patient or date at all. So I'm just trying to recall the two factor 9 patients. Right, I've identified one, but it is not the 1985 to 1986 patient. No, I don't. I would suggest if you want further information on that, you'd have to ask Dr. Tate, who looked very exhaustively at all the relevant data back in 2011.
All right. Well, it doesn't look like I can take the understanding of the table any further. Can I then ask you next a little about how the care and treatment of patients infected with HIV was undertaken and organised at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary? In particular, what was the division of responsibility between the Royal Infirmary and Ruck Hill in terms of their care?
Well, this started very early. Dr. Dermot Kennedy and Dr. Campbell Love were the two infectious disease consultants who initially were the people who took on the care of patients who are HIV positive. But it was Dr. Kennedy in particular, who is a neighbour and friend, I should declare, who was extremely helpful. And as you can see, he attended the AIDS group meeting on the 31st of May. And Dr. Forbes and I, by this stage, had discussions with him about how are we going to do it. And we thought the best thing to do is to arrange particular timed appointments to see the HIV positive patients, where he would attend and we'd do a joint clinic. And depending on the patient, that would either be the two of us or me just doing the haemophilia and handing over to Dr. Kennedy or vice versa. So we would want to try and build up our individual relationships as a haemophilia doctor and infectious diseases doctor with the patient to say, right, we're both looking after you. I'm expert in this, he's expert in that. And I think we worked pretty well. We devoted quite a lot of time, I think at least an hour to these sessions. And if we saw the patients individually, we'd then have a combined chat and say, well, what we recommend for your haemophilia is this, and what we recommend for you is that. We had these policies worked out, as I briefly mentioned, that if it was a straightforward bleeding problem, they'd continue to come straight to a haemophilia centre because stopping bleeding is still the priority. But if there are particular circumstances that it's better for the patient to go to Rockhill, like an acute infection, which might be HIV related, probably the best thing to do is to go to Rockhill. And while if they're admitted there, if they need something from us, like factor or anything hematological, we will come out and do that. So we worked out these policies. They didn't always work perfectly, but we learned with experience. And then the patient had these both resources available. Also, the nursing staff spoke to each other. So our haemophilia sister had a good relationship with the infectious disease ward staff at Rockhill, and we got to know each other, and I think that worked well. And when it came to the treatments that were appropriate, the first two of which were the AZT drug, well, Dr. Kennedy would be very much in charge of these anti-AIDS drugs, and he would prescribe them and monitor them and tell patients about the adverse effects, etc. And the other drug we used initially was the inhaled pentamidine, which before oral Septrin was the way to prevent the highly fatal condition of pneumocystis pneumonia. And we set up a room near the haemophilia centre where they could be taught the inhaled pentamidine technique. So I think we cooperated pretty well. And when it came to the more additional therapies over the years for HIV, we were in frequent contact with the pharmacist at the Brownlee Centre about the monitoring of drugs and blood tests and things, and we collaborated very closely upon that.
Now, in the period from late December 1984, whenever it was that heat-treated factor VIII concentrates became available and were supplied to patients at the centre, to April 1987, the PFC product, factor VIII concentrate NY, was understood, or believed and hoped to inactivate HIV, but not non-A, non-B hepatitis. Is that right?
Well, at the start, I think SNBTS were pretty confident it would be protective against HIV because of data from other manufacturers and sources, and that was closely monitored. But there was certainly, when you say doubt, it was not proven that it would totally eradicate hepatitis C. And I think, as you say, from about 1986, when I think the first case was in Edinburgh, it was realized that it was less effective, and that led to SNBTS, as you know, treating the product with a higher degree of heat treatment. But there was this window period, which is well recorded, where patients could get hepatitis C, particularly if they hadn't been exposed before. The alternative was to give them cryoprecipitate, but has been extensively discussed. The risk then was, could you get HIV, even despite the blood donor screening of HIV? So it was a difficult time, and that was discussed a lot.
I want to understand what the policy of the or protocol system at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary was in this period to address the position of the minimally treated or previously untreated patient presenting with a possible need for treatment. As I understand your evidence to the Penrose inquiry, please correct me if this is wrong, the Glasgow policy during this period was that a moderately severe or moderate haemophilia A or von Willebrand sufferer who hadn't previously been treated or had been minimally treated would be likely to be treated with cryoprecipitate because of the small pool size as opposed to the thousands. That was what you told the Penrose Inquiry. Is that correct?
That is correct. And the policy, as always, would be made by discussion between Dr. Forbes and Dr. MacDonald and Dr. Davidson, because you had to prescribe a product from blood transfusion. Yes, and I think when push came to shove and I was asked at the Penrose Inquiry, well, if it was you and you've just been diagnosed, what would you have? And after much persuasion, the Penrose Inquiry said, I'd probably go for the cryoprecipitate.
And you also, I think, told the Penrose Inquiry, again, please correct me if this is not what the policy was, but that in relation to mild patients, that the treatment of choice during this period for mild patients would have been DDAVP, and that would have been sufficient to accommodate most situations.
Yes, we'd always try DDAVP if possible. As you know, there's a variable response, but I think we proactively gave all these patients test doses of DDAVP to see what we could get, and then give that as first choice always. And then if it didn't work, we'd have to go to a blood product.
And presumably, if your product of choice, first choice for the moderate or VW patient was cryoprecipitate, for the mild patient, again, it would be cryoprecipitate before concentrate at that point in time.
Yes, and certainly for the von Willebrands. Yeah.
You've referred to a case in Edinburgh. I'm not asking you about that case, but were there any cases, to your knowledge, of patients infected with non-A, non-B hepatitis from factor concentrates in this period, this window period in Glasgow?
Yes, and I think you do have the report from the 2000 Scottish Executive Inquiry, which was set up to look at this very issue. We all at the Haemophilia Centres looked very carefully through all the records and recorded how many patients received treatment during this time window with either cryoprecipitate or with the PFC factor trait, or both. And we did that across the country, and I think the report tells you that there were less than 10 patients affected, and I don't know if you have a table of the results.
Well, we've got the report. I'm wondering do you have any recollection of what the position was in relation to Glasgow? Royal Infirmary, if you don't worry, we can look at the document ourselves.
I think we had 2 patients from memory at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary.
What, if any, knowledge did you, or as far as you're aware, the centre have at this time of what else SNBTS was undertaking, or PFC was undertaking, to try and produce a factor concentrate that would effectively eradicate non-A, non-B hepatitis?
I understood they were working hard on it, and they'll give you the details. Yeah.
Did you at the Royal Infirmary have access during this period to it on a trial basis to any SNBTS product that was being worked on in the way you've described?
I'm sorry, I can't remember. You mean what you mean worked on? You mean the trial of a more heat-treated?
Yes. Did you have access to their trial products?
I'm sorry, I can't remember.
The BPL product 8Y during this period was being evaluated, and with a point in time came, I'm not going to ask you to consider documents as to when precisely that point in time was, when it was understood or thought to be effective in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis. Did it occur to you or any of your colleagues at the centre to try and get hold of a stock of 8Y at any point during the window period?
I didn't know it was available.
You alluded yesterday, I think, to there being a shortfall of Z8 in 1988. Without going into the full background or detail of it, what was your understanding of the reason for the shortfall?
I think I've addressed this in my written statement. and the documentation is laid out in meetings between Scottish Haemophilia directors and SNBTS at this time. And I think it was multifactorial. SNBTS reported in 1988 that there had been reduction in material, and there was going to be a shortfall in their production. And a factor at this time was that our demands had gone up. So there were two reasons for the imbalance. We were catching up on a lot of knee replacement surgery, for example, where patients in a lot of pain had their operations delayed, and now that we're happy that we had a safe product, we're catching up on that. So there were a variety of reasons, but there was a mismatch, and clearly we had to address it. And I think I've described to you the process that we underwent in Dr. Davidson arranging for a licensed heat-treated commercial product. I think it might have been Profilate, that was used for a couple of years.
So I'm going to move on to a topic next in relation to hepatitis C testing and treatment. Note the time. Wonder whether it might be sensible to pick that up tomorrow at 2.
Yes. Well, we'll have adequate time, I think, tomorrow
Yes.
to deal with that, won't we? So, Professor, we'll have a slightly earlier finish than we did yesterday, you might be pleased to know, and we'll come back at 2 o'clock tomorrow. The same rules apply, of course, during this period as did throughout yesterday. So 2 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.